Hello and welcome back. In this video we're going to be making a wood chair for my office out of some scrap maple and some oak that I have laying around. I start this process as usual by checking out what I have, taking some measurements and just starting to think through the project and try and maximize the wood I have just by visualizing everything. And we'll start by the table saw here, cutting out this big chunk of where some bark was previously. And I get as close as I can to that line just to maximize the piece. This wood is pretty flat, but was milled a little thinner than normal. So that's a limitation I have. So I try and make as many cuts as I can so that I don't lose any more of that thickness when I start to mill on the joiner and planer. Now over to the joiner here, getting some flat faces and edges. I start there just by getting one face, as you can see, running it through. And it cuts that face touching the blades and makes it flat to the table. So that's your first reference surface. Now I take that over and I'm gluing these into rectangles here. Just with those two milled sides facing each other. And I make some of these blocks just with two pieces glued together. You can see some of the warping in there. So using these heavy duty clamps, I'm fighting them into submission just because I didn't want to lose any thickness here. I wanted these as thick as possible. And as usual, more clamps the better when it comes to keeping wood from moving. So here's the next day coming in, taking off the clamps after everything's dried up. I can start to see what I have, which will form the main components of the chair. Now back to the joiner. I'm getting these two edges done where the pieces come together. And then I'll use that as a reference surface here against that back fence to get a 90-degree cut on that bottom face by referencing off the fence. Now I have two 90-degree faces. Now using at the planer here, with one of the faces down by planing, you get a flat surface on the top, the opposing face. I just run all the pieces through, cheating where I can to make sure to keep these pieces as thick as possible. I'm just kind of seeing what I have, looking at any imperfections on these three flat parallel sides. Now back to the table saw to cut that fourth by removing that ugly edge. Gives me a perfect rectangle. I just do that for all of them at a consistent measurement. Now I can start the process here. I start by ripping these down to rough length. Within an inch or so, I leave a little extra just in case I make any mistakes, and then I can trim up right at the end when I'm close to done. Now I'm working on the back legs, which were one of the more difficult parts of this project, as they're going to have a joint in them. So I'm clamping these pieces together to make these cuts on these two pieces perfect. And these will be the short legs, as you'll see. Now I'm flipping that piece and repeating the angle on which I'm calling the long side. And you can see how the back leg comes together here at this joint that I'm going to start by reinforcing with a dowel and using this jig by Rockler. This is drilling in by marking on both sides of the piece. You can put a dowel in between them that helps with alignment. Does add a little bit of strength, but I wouldn't count on it. It's more for aligning pieces while gluing. Now taking that out and putting some glue in and around that dowel mark there. Making sure I get enough glue in there and around that joint. And then I'm able to clamp it to the table and then use a longer clamp as a stretcher from one edge to the other to pull that joint closed. And that dowel helps with that alignment so it doesn't slide off. So this is one part of the back legs, and I'm going to join that together with this piece of flat stock here that I'm cutting with a angle grinder. I end up jumping up to a bulkier grinder here, which cuts a lot quicker. It's not pretty, but it'll do the job for what I need it to. And that piece of angle will join permanently those two pieces of wood together. And I'm going to recess them in as I'm doing here with a router, so that when these two pieces get glued together, the metal is buried within and you'll never see it, but it provides all the strength for that joint. After the router, I come in with a chisel just to start cleaning up that recess. And as this isn't seen, it doesn't have to be perfect, but it's still very good practice for cutting joints that do matter. And there's a few spots where the router went outside my line, and I'm okay with that. So I work that piece in till it fits tight, and I repeat that on all of them. And then I add a few screws, one on each portion there, just to pull it in further and add some reinforcement. And then to top that off, I'll ultimately put epoxy in here after checking that there's no protrusions. And that epoxy will lock that all into place. Now the next day I just rough sand everything just to remove any high spots and make sure that this will be a nice clean joint when I glue these pieces together. Now you can see these mirror images, how I made them on opposite sides. And I kept the wood from the same area of the log so that they're somewhat symmetrical and similar characteristics. Now I add more of that epoxy onto one of the pieces, spreading it out with a piece of wood here. And then that gives me the ability to have a little bit more working time. And then clamp them together here. Now you can see that that forms the back leg with those two pieces of metal on the inside, so that it's never seen, but provides strength to that potentially weak joint with just a regular miter cut. Now wiping off as much epoxy as I can, knowing that I'll be able to get it later with sanding. Now I'm laying out here for a mortise and tenon. This is for the arm and front legs. It's one assembly. Using a combination square, just taking some rough measurements here, just making sure it's consistent. I lay out this joint, which is mortise and tenon. It's pretty much a chunk of wood that slides into another. And by utilizing a small edge here, a cheek, it allows you to not be as precise, but get a tight joint. And it's a very strong joint. And I mark my waist there with an X, just so I don't get confused when cutting. Now we'll take it over the table saw to start this process here. As there's only two legs, I'm only making 2 cuts here, so I didn't bother to set up a jig or a stop block, but you just as easily could do that. I just follow that line to establish that cheek, and then I move into the cut towards the top of the joint, and that's where it gets pretty quick, and you just remove the bulk of that waste with the table saw here. Just by sliding over a little bit, taking another bite, and repeat that on all sides until you're left with your tenon. Now the mortise, I use a Forstner bit just to remove the bulk of the waste. I think I start with a 1/2 inch piece, or 1/2 inch Forstner bit, and then move down a size probably to 3/8, just so I can remove as much as I can without a chisel, which is ideal. And then finishing it off with a chisel, as previously, right up to that line to make a nice tight joint. And checking the fit often in between in between cuts to make sure everything works. I'll just clean up those ridges left by the table saw, and that creates a nice tight joint there. The last part I'm going to show in this video, one of two, is just cutting this back piece here, which will mortise into that back leg just at the table saw. Thank you all for watching this part 1. Make sure to stay tuned for part 2 and let me know what you think in the comments below. Thank you.